sequence, that portion of the genome with the disease. And so we started kind of through a co-design process with them, building the system that we call tangible mtDNA, which was designed to help the researchers in finding patterns and interacting with the data. Again, it was an interactive tabletop with these custom interactive objects that we call actables. So like I said, our current, in this video, it's actually a breast cancer data set that we worked with. And so they basically can load up, so you're seeing all the patients are lined up in the arcs around the object, and they can look, and then each arc is one gene, and then on each gene they can see where the mutations are. And then in the previous view, the color indicated how many mutations are on a particular gene, but they can actually dive in and look at where the specific mutations are. And so what's interesting is they might find a particular gene where they see, okay, all my patients have lots of mutations regardless of some of the other clinical parameters that they can sort by. But when they dig into the data, they might find that those mutations are actually all over the place. It's not the same one. Or they might find that, if I sort my data in different ways according to age or according to weight, then I might see that there's some patterns that emerge. So it was like an exploratory tool that was kind of helping them in terms of visualizing what they have and being able to explore it in different ways to start to even get to the point where they can ask questions before they go out and connect more data. And that was kind of one of the things that where we find these kinds of interfaces can be useful for them is in shortcutting the process between what's going on in the wet lab and sort of any models or understanding or insights that they're forming. It saves if they can kind of test out some of their ideas or find some patterns through an interface like this, and they can be more sure about them than if they're just given to them by some algorithm that they don't know what exactly it's doing. They can start to go back and test new things or define new hypotheses to test at the wet lab or collect more data. The last bit there with the clustering is also interesting because we started to build in. We haven't gone as far as to build in kind of the modeling component that we have in the Pathways project in this, but we started looking at how you can cluster according to genes in patients. And this becomes interesting in the context of, for example, you've clustered all of your patients in one particular way, and then you find that when you actually delve down into the data, a clinical researcher might look at a cluster and say, well, that's really weird. I worked with those patients, and they don't actually fall in the same cluster at all because I tried I tried the same treatment plan, and it worked for this one, but it didn't work for that one. So then they know that their algorithms are not behaving the way that they expect them to be, which is one of the huge problems with the algorithmic approaches of handling big data. And then they know that they need to go back or try a different clustering approach. Conversely, they can also, if they feel fairly confident that a cluster has generated something reasonable, or the algorithm has generated something reasonable, and they add a new patient to the data set and they fall in that cluster, it can give them like a first step of what kind of a treatment plan they might give that patient just based on what they've done with the previous patients that fall into that cluster. Okay, so in my remaining 10 or so minutes, I want to jump to the last bit of my talk about understanding cultural history. So if we looked at how tangible representations of data and kind of computational models can support forming insights in biology, the idea is also much more broadly applicable, I'd say. And so I want to extend some of this to the cultural space, where there's this really long history of use of external representations in kind of capturing and conveying cultural knowledge and stories and histories. Does anyone know what this artifact is? It's an interesting artifact. So this is called a Lukasa board, or a memory board, and it was created by the Luba peoples of Central Africa to record aspects of their genealogy and history and place. And what's interesting about the artifact itself is that it's this kind of abstract embodiment of the stories of their culture that's passed down from generation to generation. And it's while kind of the person who creates the actual Lukasa assigns the meaning to the beads and carvings on it, and sort of those carvings and meanings can't change, they remain fixed, it's this static object. The interpretation of those is constantly reinterpreted in each generation with respect to what's going on and kind of the stories of their time. So kind of from generation to generation, people will learn to read the Lukasa board and retell the stories of their personal, like their tribal histories through this object. So it's an object that's both a representation but also a piece to kind of trigger a performance and to trigger memories. And it's a very different way of kind of mapping and thinking about history that's not static or fixed, but is constantly changing and evolving because it's so tied to kind of an oral history. And we worked in this case with a project called Africa Atlanta, and they were going to be creating an exhibit at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking in Atlanta. And in the exhibit broadly, they were looking at kind of differences between Western notions of mapping versus some of the African traditions. And so in the piece they had sort of a lot of maps, but then also this Lukasa board that was in a display case. And we came into the project to start to think about, well, how can we actually give the visitors, which are largely school-age groups that come through the museum, sort of an embodied experience and understanding of the meaning of this object, which is really hard to get if they're looking at this thing that's inside a glass case with a little description next to it, or maybe an iPad video or something. So we built kind of an interactive table as an installation environment with tangibles on it as a giant Lukasa board that would invite the visitors to the museum to kind of think about how stories are created and told through this Lukasa as an artifact. And so visitors could come to the table and they could basically construct their stories around these little tangible shells by dragging beads to them. And the idea was for it to be a collaborative, performative space as well. So if there's multiple people around the table, they can then share these stories. We had another wall where the stories that had been created are then captured and reflected back. So we were capturing kind of the history of all of the stories that had been created over the course of the four-month, I think it was, exhibition. And but when you see those, it's just like looking at a Lukasa board. The meaning to them doesn't make sense unless you have someone there to reinterpret it and lend it their own interpretation. So I'll cut that short. So kind of what was exciting about this is, again, while the Lukasa itself was in this glass case in the exhibit, and it was inaccessible to all but the visual sense, the experience of engaging the story construction at the giant digital Lukasa table gave the visitors kind of a clearer sense of the embodied and performative aspects of the Luba peoples. And this is generally kind of a broader challenge with museums, where cultural and historical artifacts have to exist in glass cases for preservation reasons, but in order to fully understand and appreciate what they represent requires a far more multi-sensory and embodied kind of engagement. And so that leads to my last example on multi-sensory museums, which kind of spun off from this project, which was looking at how we can communicate and contextualize the historical and sensory and embodied experiences of cultural artifacts using an embodied and digital media, because we can't actually use the original artifacts themselves. So in this project, we focused on these rosary beads, which are kind of small devotional objects. They were inspired by a collaboration with the Ontario Art Gallery, which holds a collection of about 10 of these, and there's pretty small things, and they were sort of at a loss of how to engage visitors with these objects in glass cases. And the other thing that I should say is they are truly multi-sensory objects. So they contain various fragrances inside them. So they were like pomanders, and they were created for kind of a rising merchant class as symbols of wealth and piety, and they were carried around as kind of these personal religious experiences for lay people. But in the museum, none of these kind of sensory qualities can be experienced by the visitor directly. So what we did is kind of some initial design explorations with this idea was to reconstruct the time and place of the prayer nuts through different sensory experiences that would kind of give the visitor different entry points into what the kind of full experience of this artifact would have been at the time. And what I should say about this piece is that unlike the Lukasa one where we actually partnered with the museum and it went into the museum, this one was completely just exploratory interactions that were designed in our lab. So the technology side of it was not resolved in a way that could actually go into a museum exhibit, but much more preliminary. But I'll show we had sort of 3 different entry points as we thought about them. into experiencing these artifacts. And the idea, if it went into a museum, could be that these might be alongside each other, or you could take all of these sensory experiences and fold them into one. We're not sure exactly, but there were sort of initial explorations. So again, not being able to use actual prayer nuts, we made our own on the 3D printer. And then we also worked with a smell researcher who designed some of the scents and inspired by the types of fragrances that were put into rosary beads. So our first one, they all had, traditionally, prayer nuts had carvings of biblical scenes inside them that evoke different narratives from the Bible. So one aspect of it is just being able to run your finger over it and experience that scene and then reflect on the meaning of that and kind of have that evoke a narrative. So that was the first of the experiences. The second one is that most technology is all about kind of pulling us in and keeping us engaged and having us interact. So how do we actually give the other kind of experience? You go to a museum now and you see, I see it with my kids all the time. There's just iPads everywhere and they want to touch things and then they want to jump around and interact with the wall, but they don't really reflect. Like they don't stop to say, okay, this is something that actually I had to meditate with, or it was a prayer object. So in this interaction, the kind of slowing your breathing and holding it steadily would trigger the kind of the removal from the marketplace scene and the kind of chaos around you and transport you into a meditative scene with the sort of cathedral and music. And then the last one I mentioned, the smell, was kind of the sensory interaction. In our prototype, we ran a small kind of study in our lab. In our prototype, we didn't actually put the scents inside the objects, but had them because we wanted to kind of isolate them. There's all sorts of issues when you add smell to interactive technologies, so we had them inside these wine glasses next to it, hence the wine glasses that the subjects had to smell. Basically out of time, it's 2:30. And so just to wrap up, going back to this first kind of big picture of what I work on is that, so I started off by noting this opportunity that we have as HCI researchers to draw on this growing body of knowledge about how our brains and bodies work together to inform the design of experiences that can leverage both physical and computational media to support and enhance our creativity and cognition. And our world is kind of increasingly digitally mediated. We connect people remotely. We provide access to big information repositories, and lots of these are great for assisting in tackling complex problems. But at the same time, we will remain embodied beings who live in a kind of a shared physical world and material world, and so we need to think carefully about how we connect that. And perhaps so what I think is most interestingly is really thinking about, back to the first spatial cognition work that I think can underlie and provide lessons for a lot of the other experiences, is what is the added benefit of the computational, right? Like there's stuff that we can do in the physical world, and by default, though I'm a technologist, I'm a computer scientist by background, and so I would want to put technology in everything. I don't think that's the right place to start. I think you should you have to think critically about when and how we use technology, and it's really in the cases where it can change something for us, where it can augment the way we're able to think about the world or view the world, where we should, or like I mentioned, some of the benefits of connecting us across distance, that we should start to incorporate it. The work that I'm particularly interested in is the work that can really augment the way that we create insights, our creativity, and whether that's in arts or in sciences doesn't matter to me so much, but what are the approaches that we can use that still ground us in the physical world but can leverage the computational world when and how we need to. But this remains this kind of a space where everything's sort of a moving target. So when we're designing for discovery and learning and creativity, we're operating in kind of really open territory, because areas like spatial cognition and computational science are sort of their own can of worms. And I've learned this very much from working with scientific research labs, is like with the mitochondrial DNA project, is that they actually don't know what they're doing. So like we have to come in and design in a space where we're working with people who don't actually know what they're doing, and we don't know what we're doing either. So it makes for this sort of an experience. But at the same time, I think that the more that we can kind of connect people across disciplines will really help us in addressing when and how to use technology, rather than just kind of blindly putting things out there without actually knowing what effect or impact they might be having on the way that we think about and view the world. So I'd say that that's kind of the thing that I'd like to leave you with. That was just kind of a wrap-up slide of some of the things. And I just, I'll say thank you. And of course, to my postdoc students and collaborators and other lab members. The ones on the slide were the ones that were all involved in the projects that I showed today, but there were many others as well. So, and thank you all.
So Ellie needs to go back to Toronto. So
Yeah, I can probably take like 1 or 2 questions and and then I'll have to run before I hit traffic. Yes.
Lovely talk. Thank you very much. Intuitively, I'm on board with the idea of the body cognition helping us understand the physical and the virtual and working together. I'm curious, kind of on the flip side, if you've ever noticed any cases where adding the physical metaphors has misled the people's understanding and they start to assume certain things that aren't true?
Yeah, very. I mean, I think so very much, and that's why, like, and in every single design case, I think you really, like, I haven't reached a point where you can easily generalize yet in a lot of these spaces, because that's a really hard thing to do. I think you're right. Like in certain cases, it may mislead people to build, like, because physical things are fixed, right? And the moment and your model is a moving thing or is a changing thing, and it's something that you're unsure about. So in cases where you don't want to provide, like, that's always kind of the biggest questions. Which are the things that you physicalize and which are the things that you don't physicalize? I don't know that I can, off the top of my head, pull a specific example where the physical model broke people's understanding of the problem, but I definitely think that through our design processes, which are always very kind of participatory, like we always work closely with the domain-specific labs to actually build up their system, and there's always iterations along the way where we go, oh yeah, we shouldn't do it that way because that's confusing everybody, we should do it this other way. And that may be like, so for example, from moving from the first pathway system to the second system, the realization that we shouldn't just have controls of virtual molecules, but that we actually needed to create physical molecules. So that might be one example of where, like, working with the users and understanding how they're thinking about the space helped us refine our system and kind of push forward to a better idea of which things need to be physical versus which things we can leave to the computational world, which was in that case this balancing act between, you may have, some of their models might have 10,000 molecules in them. So we can't physicalize all of that, but at the same time, if you make it purely virtual and all you have are controls, then you're creating a lot of limitations in terms of the way they can quickly and easily manipulate it. So what is the right way that we can provide them kind of parts of it in a physical form and then parts of it in a computational form?
Because I just wonder sometimes, like to borrow a page from science fiction film or something, there's always this moment, sometimes there's this moment where they're like, it never occurred to me consider that space was what was moving, not us. Whatever your physical model was, it's like, well, this, we got to throw this right in.
Yeah. And there's definitely like interesting work that can be leveraged in that respect as well, because what we perceive in the world, and the Amon's thesis talked about change blindness and intentional blindness, and our perception isn't always what it is. So we can actually use those manipulations sometimes to our benefit, but there's other times when, oh well, we just didn't notice that, or we just didn't realize that people didn't notice this particular aspect.
I do have a question, but I don't know if you want to go, we can ask it.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you want me to ask?
Either way, yeah.
So my question is kind of along the same lines. So we talk a lot about, you even mentioned things like virtual reality. In the virtual reality space, we have this kind of axis that we always traverse as virtual on one end, reality at the other, and then virtual reality is making it more realistic and not reality. I like the word that you use, which is physicalization. And there are some examples that you had in particular, the ones like the folded example and the one of the tire tracks. Really powerful, I think, in terms of folded is entirely virtual in many definitions of that word, but I think there's still physicalization.
Exactly.
And so there's some essence of what makes something physical that's very different than just being physical.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's worth, I think, thinking about what is that essence, and I would love to hear your opinion
Yeah, I very much agree, because I mean, I came from Hiroshi's group in the Media Lab, and there was a very fixed view of what constitutes a tangible interface. You have to couple the control and the representation. There has to be something physical. And I think you're right that there's much more. Like in the case of Foldit, the key was that was the kind of the direct manipulation and the manipulations that you could do on the model. It didn't so much matter that it's all happening on a screen and that you're using your mouse to push, but it's the connection that you're creating between what your motor system's doing and how this thing is responding. So I think that's one of the reasons that I like sort of the whole spectrum, and I think there needs to be closer connections, the whole spectrum of research from AR and VR and mixed reality and interactive surfaces through tangible and embodied interaction, because I'd say they're all going to be good for different things. Like in the case of virtual reality, it's very much goes against kind of a tangible interaction kind of ethos, but at the same time, there's cases where you want the virtual to kind of erase the physical, because there's parts of the physical that you can't adjust, but you can tweak the virtual. So yeah, I guess those are kind of my initial perspectives, as I think it's very much specific to the thing that you're designing for, and instead of thinking about, well, physical is better or virtual is better, thinking about, well, what am I trying to do with the physical and virtual, and what's the right combination of the two in this particular case? When do I need to remove some of the virtual aspects or some of the physical aspects? Or when can I use, it's not about tangible being these specific controllers as opposed to generic, more general purpose controllers. It's when is a general purpose controller necessary or needed or desirable versus, and there's lots of times where you won't want to replace a mouse and a keyboard, and those are actually really, really good at doing what they do. But there's other times when they're not so good at doing what you want to do. Like even in the case of Foldit, it would be harder. It's harder to do those manipulations with a keyboard. But having something where you're moving your hand like a kind of continuous control as opposed to button presses works better, because you're doing continuous manipulation. So it's also sort of about the degrees of freedom and the type of manipulations that you're trying to affect, and how that links to whatever perceptual effects you're trying to have through, be they visual or auditory or haptic or other. So, yeah. Great. Great. Thank you.